And welcome back. The time has come to finally start talking about UVs and UV unwrapping. So, two things I'm just going to get out of the way right at the top. First, we're going to jump into the UV editing workspace. And two, I'm going to turn on another add-on. Go to Preferences, Add-ons, and we want search UV. See, we've got UV squares. This will give us some options a little bit later on as we are actually going through the unwrapping process. So I'll talk a little bit about those controls when we get to it, but I just wanted to get that housekeeping out of the way off the top. So first question is, what are UVs? UVs refer to the two-dimensional layout of your three-dimensional objects, and they are used to map textures to your objects. So if I go into a shaded preview here, take a second to load, there it goes. So you can't see UVs when you're in edit mode, or when you're in object mode. You have to be in edit mode. But so how this works is you basically think of a cardboard box that you want to lay flat on a table. What you need to do is you need to cut some seams. You need to cut it apart so that you can lay it flat. And the art of UV unwrapping comes in you want to make sure that you are using as few cuts as possible, and you have as little distortion as possible, but you still get as flat a object as possible. So all objects have a default UV space, and that's what we're looking at here. I did actually remake the default space because, well, you'll see in a second. But this will allow us to see kind of how these two things relate. All right, so I have a sync selection option on here, and this allows me to, whatever I select in the UVs will also be selected in the 3D viewport. It'll be great for this demonstration. So right here we have a face, and in 3D space, this point, select the actual point here, and we have a point selected. Now, in UV space, this is a UV, and UVs actually refer to the coordinates of the two-dimensional space. So U is left to right, and V is up and down. Down here on the bottom left, where our 2D cursor is, it functions much like your 3D cursor, but only in 2 dimensions. This is 0, 0. We go all the way over here to the right, this is 0 to 1 in the U axis, and if we go up to the top, it's 0 to 1 in the V axis. When we're unwrapping our objects, we want our UVs, generally speaking, to be contained in this 0 to 1 space. If you have a tileable texture, it's not quite as necessary. There are other exceptions, but that's going to be one of the principles that we work off of, and we're going to keep everything in that 0 to 1 space. So we have this UV selected, and we can see the vertex selected in 3D space. Now, the thing to consider about this UV is this point. Actually, go back to the sync selection. This point is actually a few different points in mesh. It's not showing up here, and that's because I actually have this separated because I have it animated. But if let me hide this cube. Now we have just a plain cube here. Okay, you can see the UVs are the same, and I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to grab one point, a UV. You can see it actually grabs 3, and that's because this point. Let's see, which point was that? That is, there we go. It's this point over here. This point in the 3D space, this vertex is connected to 3 faces, and so we're seeing that here. Now, how this works with textures is that it takes these, once we unwrap this, it takes, say, these faces, and it figures out, okay, if I have a texture loaded up, it's going to take the UV coordinates, so in this case, let's say it's 0.6 over and 0.5 up, All right, and it's going to take whatever texture is at that coordinate and it's going to apply it to that UV. Okay, that's how the mapping generally works. Now, this is the type of thing that works a lot better as you start to do it. You kind of develop an intrinsic understanding of how it works. So I'm going to try to get into this pretty quick, but I did, as I've alluded to a few times already, prepare a brief animation to help you understand this. So I'm going to turn on my textured cube here. And so first the first thing we have to do is we have to unwrap these objects. And what that kind of looks like is this. You have this object, and you cut seams on it, and you do it in a way so that you can lay it flat. Okay, now, I should also note that when you're doing this on the objects for real, you don't have two objects. Okay, your UVs are not a separate object, they are the same object, and this unwrapping process is done more or less virtually, like you can see it in the UV editor, but you're not creating a new object. This is just for illustrative purposes. So what you do is you cut those seams and you lay it flat. Then once you lay it flat, you apply your texture. And once you have that texture applied, Blender automatically knows, because well, not automatically because you have to do the UVs, but once you apply that texture, Blender knows how to then wrap that back around the cube. Okay? You unwrap it, you apply the texture, and then I'll play it backwards. And then the texture gets applied back on it. So that's the process we're doing. A cube is almost as simple as it gets. The simplest would probably be a plane. But if you can understand the cube, then you'll have a better sense of how everything else works. Okay, and so the first thing that I want to do is actually go through the process of UV unwrapping a default cube. Okay, so I'm going to hide this collection. I'm going to add in a new cube. All right, so here's our default cube. We'll go back into solid view for a moment, and we'll go back to our UV editing workspace. Now, as I said, you've got default UVs here. I'm also going to expand this over. I should mention in the UV editing workspace we have our 3D view, and then we have the UV editor. This is similar to the image editor, but it offers you different tools, and in this case, since we're doing UVs, we want those UV tools available. I'm going to hit this X to clear the image. Just focus on the UVs. So this is the default UV unwrap. It's one of a few different ways you can unwrap a cube. But you'll notice that this is taking up as much space in the 0 to 1 UV space as possible, with the exception of if you kind of rotate it on its side, but we'll keep it aligned with the workspace. You'll also notice that everything is connected. Okay, so those are the principles that we want to try to follow here when we unwrap it ourselves. Now, to help evaluate how good of a job we're doing with unwrapping, Blender does offer some additional tools to check in on our progress. First one, if we hit N in the UV editor, and we go to View, excuse me, and under Display Overlays, we can turn on a stretching overlay. And we can set this to either angle or area. What that's going to do is it's going to look at the geometry in 3D space, compare that to the UVs, and the closer they are to the same, the more it's going to be towards blue. The closer they are, or the more difference there is between the two, the closer it's going to be towards red. So, for instance, if I take this face, this quad in the UV space, and I scale it way down, you can see that turns red. It's because this area is not comparable relative to the rest of the faces as it is in the 3D viewport. So that'll tell us if something is wrong. We can also adjust the angle, or look at the angle. So if I take this one, I'm going to turn off image parity. If I take one UV here and I move it around, you can see that there's going to be some stretching there. Now, there's another way that we can view this stretching that is perhaps even more illustrative of what's going on, and that's by using a UV test image. Now, you can find UV test images all over the place, but Blender also has a couple built in. So I'm going to click up here in New Image, and we will call this UV_test, and the width we will, for now we can leave it 1024 by 1024. Now you can set this either to a color, but we want a generated UV grid. So UV grid, if I click OK, you can see this is what we get. All right. So we've got a checkerboard pattern with colored pluses, and we can use that to project onto our cube. But we do need to do a little bit of extra setup. In Blender, it's not like a one-click button that'll automatically show that pattern on our object. So what we need to do is set that up. I'm also going to turn on screencast keys before I forget, then hit T to hide the toolbar there. Okay. And then screencast keys didn't turn on. Where's my screencast keys? Not seeing them. All right, I got the screencast keys back. I think the offset was just too high, so we'll put that. Interesting. We'll put that like over here. Okay, so we need to apply this texture, and the way that we're going to do that is we're just going to make a new material, and I'm going to call this UV_test. And then next to base color, I'm going to click on the little yellow dot, add in an image texture, and instead of clicking new, I'm just going to click on the little image icon and select my UV test. Okay, so now we can see our UV test grid, and we can see if we take this UV and move it around, you can see how that distorts the pattern. So this is why we need our UVs to be as straight, even, uniform as possible, so that when we apply a texture, we don't get distortion. Okay, if this was a brick pattern, and everything looked good until we saw this side and it looked like this, then that would very much ruin the illusion of bricks. Okay. Now that's the UV grid. We also have a color grid, and actually I prefer this one because it also allows us to see the orientation of our UVs. I'm going to quickly just undo that move, and we can see which way the faces are oriented. And that will help us so when we are either painting or texture or using an image texture, we have things oriented in the right position. So as we take these UVs and grab that face, there we go, and rotate it, we'll go around to this side. So which face is that? Oh, it's the bottom face. Let's grab a different face. Grab this one. Oh, it's the top face. There we go. Okay, so as we rotate this, see how that texture rotates, but you also notice how that affects the other UVs around it. All right, so we got to watch out for that as well. So let's just get into this and start UV unwrapping it. So the way that we UV unwrap is we add something called seams. And what a seam is if you think of sewing, a seam is a kind of split or a union between two surfaces. It's an intersection or a border. So if we're trying to replicate that same UV layout, we know that we want, let's say, this top. We know we want this top to flip. Or actually, we'll say this face. We want this face to flip up so it lays flat and in line. What we can do is we can select these three edges, right-click, or excuse me, yes, right-click, and mark the seam. When we do that, see the edges turn red. They have a red highlight now. That tells us that there's a seam there. And what we can do is now we can unwrap it, and we'll see how we did. Okay, I'll go back to material preview. So This is, we go to our UV maps. Basically what this is doing is this is going to, as soon as we do this, it's going to cancel out the default UVs. All the primitives have default UVs, but once you start making changes to the object, then they no longer become useful. So I'm going to select everything. I'm going to hit U and unwrap. When I do that, this is what we get. So we've got some things that we need to kind of figure out here. I'm also going to hit N in the UV editor and just hide that, hide those properties for now. So we've got one face here that looks okay. You can see there's still some distortion here. Let's also turn on its side. But everything else is just awful. So we need more seams because this is not laying flat right now. Right? Think about if you just took a box and just cut 3 ends off a side, the whole rest of it is still attached. So if this is the top flap that we want to flip up, we now need to address, let's address these sides. So we want this side to also flip up. So I'm going to leave it connected at the top. But I want that to flip, and then this side here, I want to flip. We'll mark those seams. And then the bottom is already able to flip to this one. And this one, we've got 2 seams on each side. We've got 2 seams on each side, so that can then flip up to the top. So now we'll hit U, or if you don't select everything, then you won't unwrap. So you need to hit U, select everything, and unwrap. And now you can see it unwrapped. And it looks almost like it did before. It's just turned on its side. All right. So like I said, one thing that you generally want to do is you want to have all the faces rotated in the same orientation. So let's take care of that next. Okay, so to do this, if we just select all of our UVs and we rotate them, I can hit R to rotate just like I normally would in the 3D viewport, and I can type in 90 and hit negative on the number pad. Now I've rotated that. And these 2 faces look pretty good. The rest aren't quite working out. So we've got a few different options. One is we could just say, it's fine, it's good enough. Or we can change our seams around. To do that, we can either select our seams and hit clear seam, or we can just work with the seams that we have, kind of reorient them. So let's do it that way so you can see a couple more tools that we have to work with. So in the UV editor, I'm going to first hit this X to clear the UV test grid. It's just going to clear it out of the UV editor. You can see it's still applied in our viewport. And I have faces selected, which is what I want. So you can see right now I can't really move things around, because if I do, it starts distorting the adjoining faces. So what we want to do is find a way to rip them apart. And as it turns out, there is a tool for that. We right-click. Actually, it's not in the right-click menu now, is it? Okay, it's in the UV menu, and we have UV face, rip, and join. So Alt-V and Shift-Alt-V are our options there. So I'll select this face, and Alt-V, and then we can hit G to move it, and now it's detached. We've ripped that apart. Okay, so I'm going to do that and move it over. And we'll come around to the other side here. And this is where it can be useful to have selections linked, so you can kind of see what you're grabbing. Okay, so I'm going to hit Alt-V on this one. Then I can select that and hit G to move it. And we have the rest of these faces. And I'll do the same thing. I also mention we can select edges. We can hit, I believe we can hit Alt-V and rip those edges as well. Either one works. But I'm going to do this by face so that I don't distort the faces as I'm moving them around. Okay, I'll do the same thing here. Alt-V. I'll just select all 3 of them, Alt-V. I can move them. Okay, and so now we have all of our faces separated. So now what we can do is we can kind of rotate these around and get the orientation correct. So I'm going to select this one, rotate it, and we want to rotate this, it looks like at 90 degrees in the positive direction. So type in 90 and hit enter. This one on this side, rotate 90 degrees in the negative direction. And this back face, looks like we need to rotate 180 degrees. When we do that, I've made a mistake. My mouse was over the 3D view, so I'm going to undo that. Make sure my mouse is in the UV editor. R180, hit return. Okay, my screencast keys aren't. Set that offset to 0. Okay. So those are now in the right direction, all of them. Let's go and hit 1, go into the front view, so I can orient myself in the scene. I'm happy with where that top is. That's oriented in the right direction. And then the bottom, I'm fine with that. It could be that way, or you could rotate it 180, but I'm fine with that. Okay. So now that we have all of our orientations, now we can kind of start laying this out. All right, so let's, we want this face and this face, whoops, this one and this one to be connected, these two. So what we can do is I can grab this edge right here. We can right click and say stitch. When we do, it moves the faces together and it now links them. So as I move one, whoops, it was supposed to link them. Nope, don't want to do that. Hold on. Okay, I undid back and it's working now. I'm not sure what I'm doing differently, so maybe if you're watching this back and forth and you don't have the 5-minute gap in time, maybe it'll be more apparent to you. If it is, I'd love to know. But now if I select this edge, right click and stitch, you can see it, they jump together. Now I can grab the faces, and as I move that around, you can see that it is in fact connected, which is the behavior I was expecting. I don't know if it was because I was this view. That might have been it. It might have been because I was in the UV sync selection. So if I undo that, or get out of the UV sync selection, we have to select everything in the viewport to see all of our UVs, and now it is behaving as I anticipated. Okay. So I know I've kind of glossed over this, but we have UV sync selection, and then we have the options to select UVs, think of these like vertex, edge, and face. And then when we're not in sync selection, we have a fourth option, which is UV island. UV island is connected UVs. So this is, as of right now, this is one island, this is an island, and this whole thing is also an island. Okay, but we'll keep this on edge for now. And we'll go to face for a second, because we want to figure out, I believe this face is this one here with the E1 and E2. So so that's that. So we can grab this edge with 2 in the top row, grab that edge and right click, stitch. Right? And then we've got one more, this G4 and 5. I believe that's this one. Let's see. Grab this. Nope. This is where sync selection can come in handy. Okay, it's this one. Right? Get out of sync selection. I'm going to grab this edge, right click, and stitch. Great. So now we have that. All of these are connected. We can go to our island selection options, hit G, move it around. You can see we are in fact grabbing the whole island, and that's all moving and staying consistent. Now we just need to attach these top and bottom. So I believe we want to attach it here. Again, we'll turn on sync selection. Yep, okay, so these are the two that are related. So we'll grab edge, select this edge, right click and stitch. And then let's grab this bottom face, and we might as well just keep that connected right there. So we'll grab that edge as well, right click and stitch. Okay, we can turn off sync selection, Select everything in the viewport. Got island selection now. We can move it around. See, everything is connected nicely. Okay. This also brings up another point as we look at these edges and seams. As you can see on some edges, the texture is continuous, right? So D6, D7, we can read that around the corner. On other edges, it's not continuous. So think about where you're putting your seams and where you want continuous textures to wrap around and where you don't need that. You know, sometimes it's not going to be necessary to have that wrap around. Sharp corners can be a good place to hide seams. Just depends on the specific texture that you're going for and the needs that you have. Okay. I will also point out that the UVs here don't really seem to quite line up anymore. Right, you can see because we obviously have a seam here, but in the viewport we don't have a seam. And if we select everything in the viewport and hit U and unwrap, got some issues there. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure why that happens. Okay, I don't know if there actually is a way to get that to live update while it's happening. If there is, again, I'd love to hear about it. And but there is a tool for this such instance. And that is, if we select everything, select the UV island, go to UV, and seams from islands, it's going to look at our island, figure out where there should be seams, or where there are seams in the UV space, and it's going to add them to our 3D space. So UV, and seams from islands, and you can see now we have all of our seams added. So I can select everything, U, and unwrap it, and the same thing happens. We get the same shape that we should. We just have to rotate this 90 degrees, and we get back to our correct orientation. Okay. Now, the last thing that we need to do is once we unwrap it, and let's say this was scaled down for some reason. One, you can look and see how when we scale down a UV island, the texture appears to get bigger. And as we scale it up, the texture appears to get smaller. This is why when we're working in the shading space with the nodes, when we increase the scale, the texture appears to get smaller. This is what's happening behind the scenes. Because as we're increasing the scale, the texture appears to get smaller. So we're scaling the UVs, not the texture itself. So once we have our UV unwrap, then there's two important steps that we need to do to kind of help finish this off. And that is going to be to average the island scale and then to pack the island. So there are two tools that I use all the time. And I would actually encourage you to, there's these two right here in the UV menu, pack islands and average island scale. I would encourage you to hover over each of them, hit Q, or excuse me, right click, and add them to your quick favorites. I've already done this on mine, but add them to your quick favorites because you'll be using them all the time. Once you have that, you can also assign a custom shortcut if you prefer. Once you do that, then you can just hit Q and average island scale and then pack islands. Now, average island scale, what that will do is if you have multiple islands, it will scale them individually so that they have the same relative size as they do in the viewport. Okay, this will help so that if this was a brick texture, you don't have, here actually, I will show you. If we select these two faces and we hit Alt V, and then we can move them apart. And I believe, yeah, okay. So we have two islands now. Now, if I select this island and scale it down, and we look over here, we can see that these two faces, texture is larger than it is for the rest of it. That's generally not something that you want. So, we select everything and hit Q and average island scale, it's going to fix that. Right? And then, once you do that, I'm just going to undo back to a single island. Once you do that, then we have pack islands. What pack islands are going to do is it's going to take all of your different islands, and it's going to try to fill as much of the UV space as possible. If we look at our options, we do also have a rotate option. So it may or may not rotate, depending on your choice. I tend to have the rotate option off, because if I've gone through the effort of making sure everything is oriented in the correct position, then I don't want the pack islands to throw that out and just rotate it however it sees fit. It also has a margin option, and this is particularly when you're painting, but this will give space between both the edges of your UV space and islands themselves, so that you can have a little bit of a buffer. 0.02, 0.03 is kind of enough for what I've been doing so far. If I was doing hand painting, I might increase that a little bit more. But we don't want to go too high because we don't want to waste space. All right, we want to pack the islands because we can fit more pixels, more texture detail the larger this is. Okay, so we don't need to go up to a larger map. We can use a 2K or a 4K map and get just as much detail as we would if we didn't pack the islands and it was like this small and we used an 8K map. Right, so it's just a more efficient way to work, a cleaner way to work. Right, so that's UVs kind of sort of in the nutshell. If we go into the UV or into the viewport, we can see that we've got a few different options for unwrapping. We have live unwrapping and smart projecting, all sorts of things that we will. I think I'm just going to leave them alone, and we will talk about them as we use them. Unwrap, follow active quads, and project from view are probably the ones that I use the most, aside from obviously marking and clearing the seams. But the scene that we have built, if we look at our scene, actually, let's look at this scene. Right, the scene that we have built is a relatively simple scene. I know there's a lot going on, but we have a lot of cube-shaped objects. Okay? So if we think about how we just unwrap that one cube, we can apply that to most of these boxy shapes. And that'll be in the next video. We'll actually go in and we'll begin unwrapping this. But let's take just a second and we'll unwrap a couple more primitives. Just so we can kind of see some other forms. So I will just hide this cube and we will add in a cylinder. Okay, and if we tab in edit mode on it, we can see what the default UVs are. This gives us a clue as to how we should unwrap this. All right, so we want this to lay flat, so I'm going to go in edge mode. I'm going to alt click on this edge, shift alt click on the bottom edge, right click and mark the seam. Okay, so I've got seams at the top and the bottom. Now if we try to unwrap this, we've got those two islands. We can sync the selection so we can see that. It's the bottom face, here's the top face. But the body of this, you can see, is distorted. And we can, if we want to see, we can either turn on we can either assign our UV texture, or we can turn on, in the UV space, we can go to View, Overlays, and turn on Stretching. Okay, you can see the problems that arise. That is not a great thing to do to a texture. So we need to add one more edge loop, or excuse me, not edge loop. We need to add one more seam. So I'm going to go to the front view just to orient myself. I'm going to add the seam to the back side. Right click and mark seam. Now when I select everything, view and unwrap, this is what we get. And you can see this is actually a whole lot less distorted than the original, I believe. Maybe you're making that up, hold on. Oh, we don't want to duplicate that. We want to just add in a new cylinder, GX, okay. All right, so we see here's the the default cylinder, and here is the unwrapped cylinder. All right, so we see there is a difference in the stretching here. Let's grab the default cylinder and apply the UV test grid. And we can look at it, and we can see that these squares are not actually square. All right, so we don't really want to rely on those default UVs because they're not going to give us as clean of an unwrap as they would if we did it ourselves. All right, so we'll delete that default one, go to the one we unwrapped. And then once we have everything separated, we can, desync selection, we're just going to grab the islands. We can rotate this -90 degrees, and we'll just move it over here for now. And the top and the bottom, if we go into front view here, we can kind of orient it somewhat. It's not the most important thing with these, but we can. And then once we have it how we want it, we can select everything here. We can hit Q and average the island scale, which we shouldn't see a change, but it's always good to do. And then pack the islands. Make sure rotate is off so it stays in the same orientation. Now we are using as much of that space as possible while still keeping everything proportional in the same relative size. All right, let's look at another one. And I'll just hide this. And we will add in, let's do a sphere. Spheres are tricky to unwrap. Because, and we looked at this earlier, I'll apply the UV test grid. You see the default is not the same as what we're seeing here, right? We see a bunch of relatively square polygons in the middle, and in the UVs they are all even rectangles. Okay, we can compare our texture, and you can see that we're getting a lot of distortion, and then up at the top we're getting even more. Right, so there's not a great way to, there's not a perfect way to unwrap this. One potential thing that we could do is with everything selected, we can hit U, and we can use a spherical projection. And what this does is it projects the texture onto the surface from a sphere. It's, you can think of like an actual overhead projector projecting light onto it, and that's kind of what it's doing. And it kind of doesn't give great results. So what we'll do is we're going to start cutting some seams. Now, where exactly you cut these seams, again, is going to depend on what your actual texture is, what the geometry is. You're usually not unwrapping a perfect sphere. But let's say we add in a seam right at the halfway point. All right, so let's do that, U, and unwrap. Okay, that actually looks pretty good. You can see there's one slight issue, and that is you can see the size of the squares at the top here are larger than the size of the squares down by the seam. Okay. So we can, let's try another way. I'll just select that edge, right click, and clear the seam. And let's try cutting it along a vertical edge. Right click, mark seam, select everything, U, and unwrap. Okay. So that's the shape that we get. And again, we've got really large squares on the front here, and then towards the back we get really small squares. That's not really working either. Honestly, right across the middle is probably, for the most part, what I would do. You can also do both. You can keep one at the back and one across the middle. U and unwrap. Okay, that's better, but it's all a question of where you can tolerate seeing seams. Right. So we'll get into this more with specific objects because it's a little tricky to talk about theoretically. It's better to just get into it and do it, and so that's what we will do in the next video. I will show you one last one, and that's going to be, oops, we'll just add in a quick Suzanne. We'll give her the UV grid, and we'll tab in edit mode, and we can see with organic forms especially, you're probably not going to see a perfectly all blue UV unwrap. There's going to be distortion. I'll also, in the UV editor real quick, go to UV and seams from islands so that the seams are actually cut. Okay, so you can see where the seams are cut. The ears are getting cut off. We're hiding seams in the top and the back where there's usually hair on a head. Also in these kind of backside corners where you're looking at it from the front, you're not really going to see that. Right? And with some texture painting or programs like Substance Painter or Mari, seams are less important than they used to be. There's a number of ways to hide them, but we still want to try to hide the actual seams in the geometry as much as possible. Okay, so that'll be it for this video. Next one, we're actually going to get into our scenes here and start unwrapping this. We'll start easy. We're going to start with the road first, about as easy as it gets, and then we'll move into the rest of the ground, the walls, and we'll even tackle this truss. We'll talk about some more UV considerations as we go. Finally working towards a scene that looks something like this. I know this is a little bit overwhelming, but take it step by step, and we'll all get there together. We'll see you in the next video.